Right, good afternoon everybody and welcome to a Chiltern Teaching School Hub RQT webinar. Today we have Hannah Page with us delivering a session on ongoing assessment for learning.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to bring up my screen. As already said, we are talking about ongoing assessment today. So first up, a little bit about me. So my name is Hannah Page and I've been an assistant head teacher and a specialist leader of education for assessment since 2016. During that time, I've led on teams to create assessment frameworks which have been used across our Pioneer Learning Trust and used in schools across the West Area Partnership, working across the trust to support assessment as a specialist and as an assistant head teacher. And for a brief time before COVID, a deputy head teacher has enabled me to refine and reform and really reflect on assessment for the better. I don't think I've ever stopped learning. Even for this session today, I did lots of research and really thought about what we're doing here in our school and read a few books and actually started to think about how things might change moving forward. So on that note, all online references are accredited through the presentation and all books are done on a reference page at the end. So a little something to get you started. So I know it's a webinar, but humour me so that it's not death by PowerPoint. Really quickly, what I'd like you to do is think about what you think of when you hear the words ongoing assessment. So I gave myself 30 seconds to do this. And I came up with the following. So there's my scribble. I did it as a bit of a bubble map. So ongoing assessment, I thought of data drops, workload, I mean, there's a whole host of things. So feedback, in fact, originally I put marking, so pink and green for each stars and a wish, assertive mentoring, conferencing, questioning, and then put a little caveat of all of the time. I thought about IRE, Gillian William, I'll talk about that a bit later. Building a picture, observations, what we do with all that data, so reporting to parents, governors, the local authority, the DFE. Thought about all the frameworks that we use, the national curriculum, the end of key stage. So much came into my mind. Now this isn't a complete list, but it kind of got me thinking of ongoing assessment and what does it mean? Because it's not just about the data, it's about the practice that we're doing within schools. So the first thing I wrote, to be fair, was workload. And the reason I put workload first is because, first of all, it's a lot. But also because in my role as an assessment lead and as an assessment specialist, I want to make sure that it's manageable. And then the second was marking, which I then updated because we now call it feedback. We don't necessarily call it marking. And I'll explain a bit more about that as we go on. And then the next thing I wrote was building a picture of our learners. And essentially, when we're talking about ongoing assessment, it's building a picture of our learners. So I scribbled in several places on my map summative and formative assessment, and these are both used in ongoing assessment in all schools. So formative assessment, assessment for learning, responsive teaching. It's a method of assessing pupils whilst learning is happening rather than at the end of a topic or sequence of lessons. And you do this all of the time. And as practitioners, we do this almost without thinking. It's in the questions, it's in the little observations, it's in the how are you doing, how are you finding this kind of question. So you'll see I've put some bullet points there of what it might look like: quizzes, observations, classwork, homework, discussions, questioning. And then we've got summative assessment. Summative assessment is used to evaluate learning at the end of a unit or sequence of learning, and you do it by comparing it against some standard or benchmark. They are often high stakes, but not always. So some of those might be tests at the end of a unit, SATs, GCSEs, A-levels, other statutory assessments, half-termly levelling, the data drop, as I'm sure you might have heard that term before. Both of these inform learning and both are used for feedback and both are needed in assisting future planning, because that's what it all comes down to. When we're talking about ongoing assessment, We're talking about getting information to move us going on, to move us forward, and not just us, but obviously the children. So I'm not going to have these quotes up for long, but they are important. The NFER, the National Foundation for Educational Research, gives quite a detailed explanation of what formative assessment is, and you can find it on their website. It goes into a bit more detail than what we've already covered, and I thought it was important to have in exactly the same way there for the summative assessment, again from the NFER. I will highlight that it on this slide it says towards the bottom, one of the last sentences, it will summarise attainment at a particular point in time and may provide individual and cohort data that will be useful for tracking progress and for informing stakeholders, so parents, governors, etc. And often that's what our summative data does, that data drop, that level, that outcome that you put on a report to parents, the data that we send off at the end of Key Stage 2, or that you send off in terms of coursework if you're working in secondary. Formative assessment takes place on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so it's that assessment for learning. In terms of ongoing assessment, I wanted to kind of touch on some of the research about the basics. So the teacher's role in the process is crucial as children are observed daily and a picture of their understanding and attainment is acquired through regular verbal and social interaction in the classroom setting, from Hayes 2004. Now, that's really important, and I mentioned at the beginning that it's assessment for learning. It's that you standing in front of them and knowing your children. It's in the discussions that you have. So talking to them about their learning, watching how they solve particular problems, watching how they work with other children. So again, it's a verbal and social interaction in a classroom setting. Pollard and Bourne suggested several principles of assessment. Assessment must be used as a continuous part of teaching and learning, as the process involving pupils wherever possible, as well as teachers in identifying next steps. So it's about what we do with that information. So we look at it, we see how our child is learning, we identify what they need to do next in order to either support or close the gap or push them further on in their learning. And then assessment for any purpose should serve the purpose of improving learning by exerting a positive force on the curriculum at all levels. So once we've identified what that next step is, we need to exert it as a positive force, so do something about it. So key questions for teacher assessment is to ask what it is that we want to know, understanding what information we are seeking and considering what we intend to do with the information helps us focus on what we should do instead of what we should assess and how we should assess it. So if we're looking at our learners in English and we want to know how they're finding applying capital letters and full stops at its most basic, then we would walk around and we would look at the books and we would see, we might pull a few books in and have a look after the lesson, but then we would decide on whether children on the whole had understood how to apply capital letters and full stops and move on to the next stage of English, or we would go, hold on, they're still really struggling with this, I need to change what tomorrow's lesson looks like, for example. Which moves us on to feedback and marking and its role in ongoing assessment. Now, Ross Morrison McGill, who you might not recognise the name, but you probably are familiar with Teacher Toolkit. If you Google that, there's loads of information on there. Now, he created a live online questionnaire for teachers between 2018 October and March 19. And he got quite a few responses to the 12 questions, 3 of those split into sub-questions. But from that, he identified that 78% of teachers and school leaders think that marking and assessment is a challenging area of teaching practice. It doesn't surprise me because one of the first things that I wrote down when I thought about ongoing assessment was workload. So yes, it is challenging. And I mentioned then that the next thing I wrote down on my beginning, on my bubble map, was feedback. And in fact, I wrote marking. So verbal feedback should be the default method in all schools as it provides immediate focused feedback to aid students in the lesson rather than weeks later after they've long forgotten about the piece of work or when learning has moved on. So every school will have its own marking and feedback policy, Each school will be on its own journey in terms of what that looks like. So for us here at Chiltern, as part of the Pioneer Learning Trust, we call it a feedback policy. And we actually don't, as teachers, write in children's books. We don't mark the books as such anymore. However, all children receive verbal feedback during the lesson, and they themselves write down that comment. So they will talk through with us what they've done particularly well within a lesson. They'll highlight in pink the things that they've done well. And then we will say to them, this sentence here could do with some improving. They'll highlight it green and do that. We might say to them, hold on, there's a few questions there in your reading where you haven't quite given evidence from the text to support your inference, and they'll go away and edit. Studies of verbal feedback show slightly higher impacts overall. I'm not sure how familiar any of you are with the Education Endowment Fund, but they've done an awful lot of work on what in terms of the learning toolkit and in terms of what makes an impact on teaching and learning. And they do state that feedback is one of the most cost-effective ways to achieve progress. So they suggest that verbal feedback shows a slightly higher impact of overall 7 months worth of progress if you're doing verbal feedback correctly. Providing feedback is well evidenced and has a high impact on learning outcomes. Effective feedback tends to focus on the task, subject, and self-regulation strategies. It provides specific information on how to improve, so it's not generic. And I think when we're looking at ongoing assessment, that's really important, because the easiness of it would be to go, well, that looks really neat. The handwriting looks really lovely, or the questions are really nicely laid out in maths, or I can see that you've managed to remember centimetres and millimetres. But actually, we need to really think about what it was that the children were trying to gain from that lesson. And when the classroom culture focuses on rewards, gold stars, grades, or class ranking, then the pupils look for ways to obtain the best marks. They look for ways to get the most gold stars. They look for the ways to get the most pink, rather than improve their learning. And that's backed up by research by Williams and Black. And I think it's really important that when we talk about that feedback, that we really reflect on that. One of the most effective ways to improve progress over time is children really thinking about how they're learning, that metacognition. Again, on the Education Endowment Fund, they have that full list. And metacognition, again, is up there as one of the most cost-effective ways to improve progress over time. So research tells us it's important to think about the learning objective, and my classroom practice has shown that carefully considering the success criteria can support children in meeting the objectives with greater success. So knowing the lesson objective and the success criteria offers structure for praise and constructive feedback. So that's really, really important. And when you're planning your lessons, it's important for you to think about what might the potential errors be. When we're thinking about ongoing assessment, where might they go wrong, so that you can think about how that learning journey is going to progress over time. And then, of course, when you're looking back, where did they go wrong? Again, so that you can alter that next part of the learning journey. Questioning. Dylan Williams, 2014, traditional approach is explained as IRE. So it's explained in Morrison McGill, which is it's a book called Just Great Teaching. And I would highly recommend it. IRE is initiation, response, and evaluation. However, this relatively simple exchange doesn't always tell us what professionals, what children completely understand. If you ask a child how they felt that learning went, you can't always guarantee that the response is going to be able to give you a full evaluation of where they're at. So think about what type of questions do we need to ask? How do we go about asking the questions? And I think it's really important then that we reflect that learning is a social process, and the provision needs to be made in teaching situations for that social interaction and discussion in pairs and other groups of varying sizes, both with and without the teacher taking part. It's important that they're given a chance to talk about their learning, not just talk about their learning, but question both themselves and their peers about where their learning is going. And if you're fortunate enough to hear those responses, then again, that makes a massive impact on our ongoing assessment, because you gain such a picture of what they're learning. It's a real window in. We need to be able to use a variety of questions. The use of different style of questions should form part of teachers' repertoire and, of approaches to their job. So I'm sure that in your teacher training, you looked at Bloom's, you looked at the types of different questions that we can ask. So you are not just using questions solely for the purpose of testing pupils' knowledge. So I don't want to know, can they tell me when the Battle of Hastings was? But also to enable them to reflect and develop and extend their thinking. And when you have asked questions, you need to pay attention to the children's answers, because sometimes their answers give a complete picture and sometimes they don't. And again, it requires going back and really looking and thinking about that learner and their approach. The next one is plenaries and their role in ongoing assessment. I can't stress this enough. Please do not just use plenaries at the end of a lesson. I, as myself, as a newly qualified teacher many moons ago, I was guilty of this. I would put a plenary at the end and say, how did we all find our learning today? And you'd have most of the children going, oh, it was lovely, especially if there was a visitor in the back of the room watching. Oh, it was a lovely lesson, Miss Peters at the time. You know, oh, yes, I really understood that. They might not have understood it. So please do not use these at the end of a lesson. They should never be a tick, a checkbox, or for an observer's gratification. Beadle and Morrison McGill 2019 identified that for plenaries to be effective, they need to be planned. So don't just whack one on at the end of the lesson with that generic question, how did we all find that today? They can summarise learning at any point within the lesson, and they can and should be differentiated to meet the needs of your pupils in your class. So pausing at different points through the lesson and reviewing where the learning's at so far, doing some of that collective feedback, talking to them about who's managed to include a fronted adverbial in their writing, who hasn't managed to do it. Can we share some examples of those that have, and then encourage those children that haven't to go away and do that? We could talk about that they should address any confusion or misconceptions. So if we notice that many children are looking at, they're looking at their reading questions and they've all struggled on question 3 so far out of 1 to 5, pull them all together. Let's look at question 3. Let's talk about what evidence from the text would back up that Lady Macbeth might be feeling anxious that her husband has brought 2 daggers back, for example. They, along with feedback and questioning, build a picture of what your children know. So not just at the end of the lesson, because by that point, it's too late. Ongoing assessment should be done ongoing, all the way through. So all these strategies we've just spoken about, feedback, plenaries, questions, they are used all of the time in all of your lessons so that you can build a picture of that learner and move learning on there and then. You don't have to wait till the end of the lesson or the next lesson. You can change the course of that child's learning there and then, and that's really, really powerful. In terms of what do we assess and what should we assess against, I'm a primary school teacher. I'm aware we might have some secondary colleagues listening to this. So my head immediately went to the national curriculum for Key Stage 1 and 2, but that, of course, that goes beyond. The end of key stage frameworks, the good level of development, key performance indicators. I'll talk about what that looks like in a bit. Phonics outcomes, example guidance. There's lots of things that gives us guidance on what we should be assessing against and how we should be assessing. And it's really important that you are familiar with those key documents. For me in primary, I make sure that my colleagues in year 2 and year 6 are really familiar with the reporting and assessment arrangements for the end of their key stage. My reception colleagues are very familiar with the good level of development and the changes around that. It's really important that these key documents, if you're in those key year groups you're familiar with, And it's really important that you're familiar with your school's curriculum and how it's laid out, because in that it will be what you are assessing against. So I've got the national curriculum up, and you can see there what we need to assess against. So the national curriculum has the skills and knowledge that we are required to teach, with some non-statutory suggestions over curriculum. I've put the link in there where you can find it. What we did as a school, because that we're a trust and we're academies within a trust, and we wanted to tailor our curriculum. So we created the Pioneer Key Performance Indicators. So in 2019, myself and colleagues in the Pioneer Trust led colleagues in developing the KPI for all subjects across the curriculum. I worked with schools across the West Area Partnership to form the base concept, and then each school adapted them to the needs of their school. So within reading, writing, maths and science, inspiration was taken from the end of year expectations in 2 and 6. We use this approach to select elements for all the curriculum subjects, identifying them as key in assessing pupil progress within individual subjects. These are now used across the trust to support staff in assessing pupil progress within the curriculum, and they build on skills and knowledge year after year. So we've got these key performance indicators for every subject, with the exception of wellbeing, and they outline between, I think it's 14 and 16 statements for each subject. Now, obviously, any maths specialists among us will be going, hold on, that's not a lot of key performance indicators. It's not the whole curriculum, and we're very keen to stress that to our staff, that it's not the entire curriculum that you should be assessing against. They are the key performance indicators that help us identify the expectation for every child's age and stage. So in terms of recording assessments, that's what we use. It might be worth having a look at your school's curriculum documents and assessment policies to identify how are you recording your assessments. There are many methods for recording assessments and many systems: Target Tracker, DC Pro, Insight, APP, old school, Heart's Learning Grid. There's loads, but teacher assessment should aim to identify which pupils are broadly in the middle of making good development through the curriculum. You should be able to record how many years below the pupil is working. So it's about picking out exactly the age and stage of the child. What approaches do you use in your schools to record your ongoing assessment of pupils' learning? So once we've got the day-to-day business of that marking, feedback, and altering our planning for future lessons, where are we doing, how are you identifying and tracking that summative assessment and that formative assessment on an ongoing basis? So at Chantry, we keep a record for assessment for learning, and we use benchmarking groups. So when teaching staff are asked to think about which key performance indicators, a selection of national curriculum objectives that the children have met, by doing this for some or all of the class, you build a picture of where the children are working. So they'll go across their key performance indicators, and they'll identify whether they've taught the objective or not. So they'll click if it's been not taught, and it will change to a red colour. They will click if they've taught it, but there's not enough evidence. They will tell me if the objective has been secured, and then they will tell me if they are working at greater depth. And they do this for a selection of children across their class. So they do this for 2 children working at greater depth, 2 children at the expected standard, 2 children working towards the expected standard, and for all children who are working below. For us, in our trust, we consider any child working below if they are more than a year below their peers. So that's the differentiation between working below and working towards. They are within a year of their peers if they are working towards, and they are working below if they're more than a year behind their peers. We don't do this, as I said, for every child. They do it for those 6 within the working towards, greater depth and working at, and then for any child working below. And this helps build a picture. I keep using this phrase because ongoing assessment is exactly about that, building a picture of where your children are working. So this is what it might look like. So I've got the art objectives up. So in year 4, they need to refine sketches to show finer detail, such as facial expressions. They need to use lines and marks to show texture within a piece of artwork. And you can see down the side there, there's lots of objectives that they need to cover. Along the top here on our system would be the pupils' names, and then you can see where they have ticked to indicate where that child is working. So the number would be the names of the children, and you can see that they've ticked it. For me, this is a spring and summer term. So when I came to do a summative assessment of these children, I might be saying that pupil 1 is working at greater depth in the art curriculum. I can see that they've mastered a lot of those objectives. However, I might be saying that child number 4 is working at the expected standard. I may well be saying that child number 8 is working toward or working below, potentially working below. But what I would be asking about child number 8 is I would ask for them to have gone back and had a look at the year 3 key performance indicators, because obviously if they're not meeting the year 4 ones, which of those year 3 ones are they able to meet? So again, it goes back to that being able to identify which area of the curriculum. So if we're saying a child is working below, we need to be able to identify where they are working. So for me, I would be asking for child number 8 for us to be looking at the year 3, potentially the year 2 KPI to identify where that child is working. This all forms part of our formative assessment. So as teachers are asking questions, doing the plenaries, doing the feedback, they might have this up on their iPad, or they might have this up at the end of the week, and they'll go through and tick off based on what they've seen in their lessons where those children are working. And again, this builds a picture over time. If we were to perhaps look at child 2, for example, if we'd gone back to the autumn term, it might be that objective number 2, use lines and marks to show texture within a piece of artwork, may well have been taught but not yet understood in the autumn term, whereas now in the spring I can see that they've secured that. So it would build and change over time. As I said, with data drops, summative terminology. In 2016, the DfE removed levels. So in primary, we used to have the level 3A, 4C, 3B, we had all sorts. But they took them all away in 2016 and told us to come up with our own. So each school does lots of different things. And again, it's really important you're familiar with your assessment policy to know how you're doing that and how you're recording that summative data over time. However, we had to use the selected terminology in primary at Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 to do our assessment to report externally. So here at Chiltern and across the Pioneer Learning Trust, we chose to use those particular keywords to do all of our assessment because it just made sense. So we've got the BLW, which stands for working below the expected standard. And as I said before, that's a greater than a year below their peers. We've got working towards the expected standard. So that's within a year of their age and stage. So you might be dipping in and out of the curriculum below and focusing on the building blocks from the previous year group skills. You've got the expected standard. They are achieving the objectives for their year group that they are working in. And then you've got greater depth. And I think it's really important here that I just mentioned that greater depth, mastery of the curriculum isn't about giving a year 5 pupil year 6 work. And we're really strong on that here. It's about looking at and applying those skills within a wider area. So brilliant, they can secure all of those writing objectives for year 5. But can they apply all of those writing objectives for year 5 when they're writing in history, when they're writing in geography? Again, in maths, brilliant. They can apply all those skills in maths, but can they apply those skills when they come to do a science experiment, for example? So again, think about what your schools use and make sure that you're really familiar with that. Because once you've built a picture of your child, at some point, you will be asked to report to this, whether it's to parents at the end of the key stage, stakeholders such as governors, you will be asked for an outcome. And then moderation and standardization. So once you've gone through this process You've done your AFL, your assessment for learning, based on all those questions. You've built a picture in whichever system you're using, whether it's a system like this or whether you just know your children. You've assigned them a summative grade. How do we know that's accurate? And any assessment, such as teacher assessment, that is not standardised is open to interpretation. And it's important that we remember human judgment is unfortunately inherently biased. In my time as assessment lead, as my time as a class teacher, I've been guilty of completing my assessment and going, oh, but I know that they can do that. I just know. I've not got any evidence. I've not seen it, but I just know that they'd be able to do it. Because I'm biased. Because you care for those children, because you develop relationships and rapport with those children, and you really want them to succeed, because not only do you want them to succeed for their own benefit, but because actually you want them to do really well because the hours that you've put in, because we're all there for the same purpose and we all want the same for our children. We want the best. And as such, it's really important to think about the moderation and standardization process that you apply. So what steps can you take to compare assessments? Are you more than a one form entry school? Can you sit with colleagues and discuss what you've got going on? Can you compare an expected standard in one year 4 class to the expected standard in another? Can you work with the local authority? Are you in a trust? Are there trust schools that you can link with? How do you know what expected looks like? In 2 and 6, that's really easy for the end of the year, for that summer term, because you've got the exemplification materials that the Standards and Testing Agency and DFE send out. But in year 4, how do you know what an expected art looks like in the spring term? And does one expected look the same if you're in a year group that's got multiple years? So, for example, I'm a 3 form entry school. When we talk about geography being the expected standard in year 3, what does that look like? And one of the things that we've done as a school and as a trust to kind of work on that, and it might be something that you think about doing, is we've started to build an evidence bank. The DFE have produced an evidence bank for some subjects in some year groups, but we as professionals can build an evidence bank, and then it's there reliable to use year on year. If you do start building an evidence bank, I would suggest it's important that you think about girls and boys. It's important that you think about pupil premium children, because obviously pupil premium children is something big that we like to report on. There's a huge amount of funding linked to it. So think about the evidence base that you've got. Moderation is used to ensure that teachers are making consistent judgments about standards, so that the assessment judgment made for any one pupil are accurate, fair, and comparable with those made for all other pupils. And that's a key point there. If you're in a 1 form entry school, how do you know that yours is comparable to the evidence of the 1 form entry around the corner? So working with local authorities is also really important. The aim is that a piece of work can be seen as providing evidence of a particular standard, regardless of who is doing the assessing. You don't need an extensive collection of pupils' work to have a useful moderation discussion, but you will need a sufficient evidence. It may be helpful to bring marked work representing the expected standard in each subject or area of learning, and where relevant, work below and beyond the expectation as well. I will say that, again, that's from the NFER. The NFER have produced a whole host of helpful guides. I believe there's about 10 of them on assessment, on feedback, that offer loads. And I know that in my previous webinar on using peer marking and self-marking, again, they've produced guides on that as well. And they've got a real base there of support in moving us forward as professionals. In terms of ongoing assessment, one of the things that everyone always worries about because of the workload, because it feels so high stakes, particularly around Ofsted, they always worry what Ofsted are going to be looking for in terms of assessment. So here it is, straight from the horse's mouth, from the handbook. In paragraph 74, Ofsted will not advocate a particular method of planning, including lesson planning, teaching, assessment. It is up to schools to determine their practices, and it is up to a leadership team to justify these on their own merits rather than by referring to this handbook. 211, research and inspection evidence suggests that the most important factors in how effectively the curriculum is taught and assessed are the following. Teachers check understanding effectively and identify and correct misunderstandings. So again, feedback, plenaries, questioning. Teachers use assessment to check pupils' understanding in order to inform teaching and to help pupils embed and use knowledge fluently and develop their understanding and not simply memorize disconnected facts. So it's going back to that questioning, thinking about how fluently do they show their understanding? Are they able to embed their learning? Their approach to teaching remains rooted in evidence and the key elements of effective teaching. Teachers consider the most important knowledge or concepts pupils need to know and focus on these. Feedback, retrieval practice, and assessment are prioritised. The medium for remote education enables all pupils to access lessons and learn. Teachers monitor pupils' engagement and communicate effectively with parents and colleagues if there are concerns. I put that particular last bit in because at the moment, if you're anticipating an Ofsted inspection, they are likely to ask about the gaps in learning. You know, what assessment do you have from the time when they were learning online? What did they miss out on? And what are you doing in your recovery planning to solve that? So you as a class teacher might not be familiar with your school's overarching plan. They will have one. It will be linked to their pupil premium spending. Their recovery funding will be allocated. But it's important that you as a class teacher know what the gaps are for your children. So if you know that you've got children in your class that missed out particularly on some of the key elements in history because you couldn't deliver that particular curriculum as effectively as you wanted to online, then it's important you go back and build those skills. It's important that you know the gaps in learning and that you're doing something about it, and Ofsted will want to know that. And then that brings us to the end with the full list of references, and again, as I said, the online references are listed throughout. I will say the Morris and McGill book, Just Great Teaching, it is an amazing book. And if you are keen on assessment, then the Data Proof Your School by James Pembroke and his colleague, Mr. Selfridge, is also a wonderful read, but very geeky in terms of assessment. So thank you very much for your time. And that is the end of the session.
Thank you for that, Hannah. That was brilliant. Thank you very much.